Well, hello everybody. Thanks for tuning in. If you're familiar with my channel at all, you would know that it's taken me ages to produce any sort of new content. I've simply told myself that I've been too busy for the last 2 years or more to do anything on the creative front. But I've had a whole heap of motivation lately and a whole heap of inspiration. I've come up with some crazy ideas, which explains the rebranding and my obsession and passion with the medieval and things Gothic and old botanical history and all that sort of thing. And I finally produced some content which I wanted to throw out to you guys and throw out to the void for anyone interested and for anyone who might find it helpful. I just want to do a whole series of videos on botanical stuff. So botanical names and conventions is where I've chosen to start. My ideas have come from teaching botany and plant recognition to many students in Australia, and just the pitfalls and the problems they raise and the complexities and the understanding and that sort of thing. So if you're a new student to plants and plant classification, botany, you might be doing some academic writing or some science communication or some assessments or anything like that. I'm hoping you find these videos useful. I'm really trying to keep them short and punchy. I really struggle with that. But I've got some goals here to try and keep them under 20 minutes. And I'll put them in parts and hopefully address any questions or comments you might have. I'm really keen to see your questions and comments in the comments box. I'll also put my email at the end of the presentation. And it helps me to keep my skills sharp as well. So I had to do some research for this video. I learned some new skills with PowerPoint, which I'm pretty happy about, from another YouTuber. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I'm just really like I said, motivated to get these up and running. So the first one here I did was on botanical names and conventions, just to try and help you with anything you might not understand. Why did we use this system? Where did it come from? And just some conventions with and around botanical names. So if we dive straight into it, whether you love or hate botanical names, some people I know sort of refuse to use them and just think they're sort of a bit ridiculous. You can lay the blame at the feet of this bloke, really. And look, I've just come up with my own sort of worded understanding of what a botanical name is, and that is interchangeably used with a scientific name. So you wouldn't say an animal has a botanical name, but it's got a scientific name, and you can also say a plant has a scientific name, but you can also say the word botanical name. And to me, they're a formalized scientific and universally accepted means of applying a name to a taxon. Now, if you're not familiar with that word taxon, it sort of means any entity we can sort of discern as being different within a classification system. So what comes to mind is a species, but a taxon can also be a genus or a plant family, or a subspecies. Again, anything in biology we think, or a taxonomist might think, is different to the species next to it, or the taxon next to it. So that's what we mean by the word taxon. It might be one that you come across. A botanical name consists of a taxonomic binomial, or a two-named title, I guess, or a two-named name, if you want to say that. A bit like our names, we've got a first name and a last name. That's a binomial name. And they were invented in around 1735 by Carl von Linné or Linnaeus. And we've been using this system now for almost 300 years. And we have arguments today that it's not the best system to use. It's a bit artificial, a bit subjective. What do we mean by a species anyway? But we've stuck with it and we use it. And you've got to think how it goes from science all the way into gardening and animals at the zoo and all that sort of thing. It's this scientific method is pretty universal. If you see that word taxonomic, or you come across someone who's a taxonomist, that's Greek meaning arrangement method. So simply a method used for how things are classified and categorized within a system. And as you know, us humans, we're very obsessed with classifying and categorizing things. We want to put everything in a pigeonhole so we know where it relates and sits in relation to everything else. What some people don't like about botanical names, what I really like, is they use Latin, or what I like to say is they're Latinized. And some people just can't cope with that. Oh, I'm learning another language here. This is pretty complicated. That's how you should see it, that you're able to now use Latin if you can get to grips with scientific names. But what I like to tell people is they incorporate other languages a lot of the time. What I like to say is they Latinize other languages. So they incorporate ancient Greek, modern Greek, Arabic, English, and other languages as a basis for the name, even Indigenous Australian and possibly some other Indigenous languages around the world too. So it's not pure Latin in a sense. It's in a lot of cases, it's other languages just being put, having a Latin spin is how I like to think of it. So when you get familiar with that taxonomic binomial, or that two-pronged name, you might be familiar that it's the first name is a genus and the second name is the species or the species epithet. And if you sort of want to know how that sits in a bigger framework, or where those concepts sort of link to, normally you can get a diagram like this. And it's argued that Linnaeus might not have been the first one to invent this sort of system, but he used it and possibly modified it. They say this sort of thinking might go back to the ancient Greeks, but and I'm not I'm not saying I'm an expert on that in any way, but if you just get familiar with what they call Linnaean classification, there's this hierarchy of classification where if we take our red fox, or European fox as a good example, and I know we're switching to an animal here, but scientific names are scientific names. We can see how it's categorized into these really broad ranks, moving down to more specific ranks, and this is how everything still to this day is sort of placed in these ranks. We've got this real high rank here, domain, and the titles of these ranks are in Latin, but we can sort of see what they mean. We can see some familiar wording in here. So if we start with eukarya, or what we call eukaryotes, that's just any organism that has cells with a nucleus. So that's a whole heap of organisms, right? That's bacteria, fungi, animals, plants, yada yada. We can see it's in the animal kingdom. So we're now moving into a distinction between animals, plants, fungi, and you can think about why is an animal different to a plant. We can see it's in a phylum is the next rank. And I've just added that word there. That's also called division sometimes, or they're used interchangeably. And that word chordata, that just means animals with a backbone or a spine, that sort of spine and central nervous system. So we're into our vertebrates. We move down, we know we have classes of vertebrates if we think back to high school, birds, fish, reptiles, etc. But we're in the mammals, obviously. We then get down to order, and if we think carnivores, maybe we're in an order of sort of predators here. Moving down into family, and we can almost see canine in that name there. So whether it's relating to a dog or cat-like group or something similar, I would assume a fox is, closely related to a dog or a cat, and I'm not an animal expert, and I'll keep saying that in my videos. But we're getting down to narrower and narrower groups, and then we get to a genus and we get to a species. And it just happens with the red fox, and I will talk about this at the end, that the genus is Vulpes and the species epithet is also Vulpes. So it's got this scientific name of Vulpes vulpes, which a lot of animals, they have that style of name where not most, but some, where the genus name and the species name is the same. And we just refer to it as Vulpes vulpes. At the end of the talk, I will go into that a bit more, because with plants, you're not allowed to do that. You can't name them like that. But that's just an example here of how this classification system works. So you can get a bit more familiar with it and just understand where that genus and species sits within that system, I guess. What I'd like to emphasize is, as a botanist, I focus on the family, genus or genera, and species levels. Okay, so I'm working here. I don't really, every time I identify a plant, I have to look at a plant. When I report on my data, my findings, I'm never talking about these pretty much ever. I'm always talking about these groups in the main. So that's where, as a botanist now with a lot of experience, this is where most of my knowledge sits. And that's really, as if you want to really learn about plants and get good at it and familiar, that's where I'd advise you learn about. You do have to learn about your families and the genera and the species that sit within those families. So family, genus, and species. In case you don't know, species are grouped into a genus, and the plural of that is genera. So if you've got multiple genus, you say genera. What I say to people is, don't confuse that with genre. Some people do. They will say that as genre. And genre is your favorite type of movie or your favorite type of book. So genera is a pluralistic term there. I've heard some people say genuses, and they argue that's a valid name. I disagree with that. We've already got a word for it, and there it is. Genera are grouped into families. So you get bunches of these grouped under this bigger umbrella here. Sometimes a family can have one genus. Sometimes it can have tens of genera. And sometimes it may even have more. There's some really large plant families worldwide. But you might come across a really obscure plant, which is a bit unique. And it just has, it might have one family, one genus, or you got your family, one genus in the family, and one species in one genus. And that's we've got terms for that. And I'd like to make future videos explaining more terms about all this sort of material. And then sometimes there are subfamilies we refer to. So what you can't see here is sometimes families get split into subfamilies, and sometimes the botanists insist that we use those subfamily names to better delineate the plants we're talking about. And then there are subspecies and varieties. So you can go below this species rank, and you can have subspecies and varieties where you just might get populations of plants that differ slightly to each other within a species. And I think I'll talk about those in a later video, just due to time. Oops, I think I froze for a second there. So we're just going straight into an example. Example 1. Here's a plant, grows in Sydney. It's a threatened species actually. It's at risk of extinction in the wild, and it's just one I worked on. But it's in a family, and that's called the Lamiaceae. And you can see that family ending. It has A-C-E-A-E at the end, and probably the best pronunciation is Lamiaceae. So that's how you will hear family names pronounced most of the time. So when you see that A-C-E-A-E, you're dealing with a plant family. We then have the genus, and that's a beautiful word called Prostanthera. And people sometimes will trip over these names, from all walks of life. I just argue that if we can get familiar with words like emphysema and leukemia, and words like cryptosporidium, a bug that might infect our drinking water, I think you can. It's how hard you want to push yourself to try and get your tongue around these words. They're not ridiculous. They mean something. And if you just break them up into even syllables, this is what I was taught in my botanical education, break them up into even syllables, it sort of moves away from a language like Greek where you've got to put the emphasis on certain parts of the word. If you just break that up as evenly as you can, Prostanthera or Prostanthera, where I'm emphasizing the second bit, but I don't really worry about that too much. That's all you got to do to sort of just takes practice and takes a bit of patience and interest. And the species epithet, the second part of the name, is in this case Denza, and that's pretty easy to say. That's not too much of a tongue twisting one there. And when we put them together, the botanical name or the taxonomic binomial is Prostanthera densa, and that's the name of this little beastie here. So all I throw in here is if you are writing these in text, if you're putting them in a report or an assignment, there's two options. You can italicize it, or you can have non-italics, but you have to underline it. Now, in a word processor and something like this, that's very easy. If you're handwriting, then you might want to, I find it a bit hard to handwrite in italics. You might just want to underline it and just keep it non-italicized and underlined. You can do one or the other, but most of the time in any scientific study that's published, any academic work, you'll see the author writing it pretty much like that consistently. Just note the convention here. The genus has a capital first letter or uppercase first letter, and the species epithet is always all lowercase. There's no exceptions to this. It's always universal. So the genus, uppercase first letter, species epithet, all lowercase. So the thing about this, it's standardized. It never changes, which makes it easy for us to get familiar with. Just some meanings, breaking it down really quickly. You can dive into and do some research on what these names mean. So one of my favorite genera is Prostanthera. So I looked into the meaning and did some research and all that sort of thing. It comes from the Greek prostheki. And because I'm learning a bit of Greek, I just got this from another document I'm working on. I threw in the Greek as well. So if you start to look at that, you can probably link some words that you know. And one of the ones that comes to mind is prosthetic. So, prosthetic leg, prosthetic arm, or prosthetic limb. It's an addendum. It translates to an addendum or an extra part that's attached onto something else. That's where we get that word prosthetic from. And anther, they're the male parts of the flowers. That's a combination of those two meanings in Prostanthera. So it just refers to the anthers having an appendage of tissue, which the first botanist to classify them, that was what he picked up on, and or he or she picked up on, probably a he, and that's what they thought was a very unique and identifying thing for this genera. And when we look at in all the flowers of Prostanthera species, we see that the anthers have this little appendage of tissue. So that's what Prostanthera refers to. And I always like to dig in and see what the meanings are. Densa, that's really easy. That's simply Latin meaning dense. Excuse me. And it refers to the dense foliage. This particular Prostanthera has comparatively denser foliage or thicker foliage than other Prostanthera species. And just getting back to that family, you think, well, Lamiaceae, like where does this come from? Did they name this after their, pet cat or their daughter or something like that? But what you got to realize is a family name is named for named after a representative genus within the family. And this is something that some people can take a while to pick up on. But within the family Lamiaceae, there's a genus called Lamium. And they're called dead nettles. They're plants from the Northern Hemisphere. And Lamium is the type or representative genus for the family Lamiaceae. So they simply sort of convert this genus, or the name of it, to the family convention or the family name by putting that ACEAE on it and slightly changing the ending. And so the Lamiaceae family is based on the type genus Lamium. And what that means is the genus Lamium is sort of the representative taxon for the family Lamiaceae. If a plant's in the Lamiaceae family, it should have these Lamium characteristics. And Prostanthera obviously does. It has the same flower shape, the same leaf arrangement. If you analyze their DNA, they would be very closely related compared to other plants. So that's where that family name comes from. It also links to a genus within the family, something you might not be aware of there. I'm just going on to example 2. I did say I wanted to keep these short. I'm really trying. This particular plant, iconic in Australia, Proteaceae. That's the family. A-C-E-A-E. It's got that ending. The genus, nice and simple, Banksia. And you can break that up and you might go Banksia. Oh, I wonder where that name comes from. That quite simple, maybe common name. Heard that one before somewhere. The species epithet is serrata. Serrata. That's a nice, easy one, I think, to, get familiar with. Botanical name, taxonomic binomial, Banksia serrata. Break it down again, and in this particular instance, Banksia in Australia is named after a person. It's named after Sir Joseph Banks. And if you don't know, he was a botanist who came to Australia with Captain Cook in 1770, collected a whole heap of plants while Captain Cook claimed the land for England, and history is history, and we've gone on from there. Serrata, Latin, the meaning, and I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to put your guess and your best thoughts into this one. I'm going to show you that really crappy photo of mine of a leaf, but you can see that leaf edge, and I'm sure you already know what serrata refers to. And yes, it means serrated, just like a serrated knife. If you look up serra in Latin, it's something like a saw or a knife. And that's a beautiful name for this particular species. It's got serrated leaves. Joseph Banks didn't name the species, someone else classified it. But they named it, Banksia serrata, based on those serrated leaves. And the family Proteaceae, it's named for the genus Protea. Protea is the type genus and representative genus. So anything that goes in the Proteaceae family should have the same characteristics as Proteas. And Banksias do. They've got the same flower structure, the same sort of fruit type. And again, if you analyze their DNA, they should be similar. More and more these days, we find that some genera shouldn't be in a particular family. They get moved to another family because, the early botanists, they just had really simple tools to try and work out flower structures and things like that. These days, we've got DNA analysis and genetics and all that sort of thing. Probably make a future video on why botanical names change. That's another thing that drives people nuts, and they wonder why it has to happen. I can do a video on that as well. But Proteaceae, named for Protea. They're from South Africa. Some rules and insights, which you might not be familiar with and just might help you a bit. Botanical names, look, they're not just written on the back of an envelope or someone's notepad and then thrown out into society and attached to, plants in the nursery and that sort of thing. They must be published in an acceptable scientific journal to be valid. And they must meet the International Code of Nomenclature for algae, fungi, and plants. This is like a universal standard, bit United Nations sort of thing. They've got to follow these rules and regulations. Botanical names can get rejected. They can get rejected by a whole bunch of scientists getting together and saying the name doesn't conform or it's inappropriate or, I'm not across all those rules, but that's what can happen. But they must be published in a scientific journal. These scientific journals might go back to the 1800s or possibly earlier, but they have to be published and recognised. The earliest published name gets priority. That means if two people are working on the same plant at maybe a similar time, and they both decide they're going to name it, and this would happen a lot in the 1800s, the person who published their name first, and if it's accepted, their name gets priority. And there's been a lot of confusion on some plants as to what the most valid name is. And that's another thing that could confuse us as well, and something in my job that I have to try and keep track of. There's a furphy here that I'd like to sort of just talk more about. The botanists cannot name a plant after themselves. Some people think that Joseph Banks sort of named everything after himself. Even back then, it wasn't allowed. Some botanists can name plants after others. You can do that. You're allowed to do that, or you might name them after places. I do know an example, a modern example, where a botanist named a whole new genus after his wife, which, you know, nice touch. Some people might disagree with that, but that's what he did. So the botanists cannot name a plant after themselves. That's just something that some people believe. Remember our red fox? Just getting back to that. It's called Vulpes vulpes. That's its scientific name. That's not allowed in botany. You can't name a plant with an identical species epithet to the genus, and that's called a tautonym. And I might do a video explaining things like synonyms or synonymous names, all those sort of concepts that you can come across in botany. But a tautonym is where the name repeats itself. Another example is the black rat, or the common rat. That's called Rattus rattus. A lot of that goes on in fauna, and I'm not a fauna expert, but you will notice a lot of birds and other vertebrates having, you know, similar or the same genus and species name. What you can have in botany is things like Tetragonia tetragonioides. This is a common plant just growing outside down the road from me on the riverbank here. Tetragonia, and then tetragonioides, where you see that suffix IOIDES, that just means strongly resembling or looks like. So what it's saying here is Tetragonia, I'm in the Tetragonia genus and I look like a Tetragonia. And you might think, wow, okay, how insightful. And that was the best name the botanist could come up with. So that's what you can have. I also came across zinioides. Zinnia, just I think you know, flowering annuals that some people like to grow. There is a species called zinioides. So I'm a zinnia and I resemble a zinnia. Is basically what that species is saying, or what the person who classified that species is saying. I like this one. There's a plant in the north of Australia. It might grow further north as well. It's called Timonius timon, and I might look that one up to see what that sort of refers to, but I really like that name. You will come across some botanical names that you really like. They've just got a really nice ring to them. You might be able to relate them to something you know in order to remember them. I've had fellow uni students back in the day, they'd relate a botanical name to their favourite football player because it sounded similar. And that was very funny when we were collecting data in the field. So whatever helps you to remember them. For me, it's practice, it's writing them down, it's learning how they're spelt. There's a convention here to be adhered to with, you know, with using a different language. Pretty much getting to the end now. People say, well, what about common names? Can I just use those? And here's some examples here. Botanic, you know, the same plants I showed. Prosanthera densa, its common name is Abilis mint bush. Banksia serrata, its common name is old man Banksia. They're fine. If you want to stick to common names, that's not a problem. If you want to write an article or maybe a report or an assignment, if you want to say at the start that I'm talking about I'm talking about Prosanthera densa, the Abilis mint bush, and if you want to refer to the plant as Abilis mint bush for the rest of the article, that's not a problem. I don't have a problem with that. So these are fine to use. All I say to people is just remember, not all named plants will have a common name, but they will have a botanical name or a scientific name. So a lot of plants, especially plants that are still sort of growing in the wild and haven't made their way into gardens or cultivation, they don't tend to have a common name a lot of the time. So people who say to me, I can't stand these botanical names, they're ridiculous, I don't want to get familiar with them, you're soon going to get stuck if you want to learn more and more and more plants, because eventually you'll find some, they just don't have a common name. And that's the way it goes. Sometimes people make up names for plants which aren't formally sort of, you know, the common names don't get published, but they're not sort of accepted in general sort of usage, but they will make it up. You know, people call plants Mickey Mouse plant or Velcro plant or, you know, tin can plant or something like that because they think it resembles, you know, something used in modern times. That's a decision you have to make, but I just like to think that people who are talking about plants, they know about the species and the genus they're referring to. So just bear that in mind. I'm going to end it there. I did get it to under half an hour. I'll have to do better in the future. I'm just going to leave you with this last slide. My email's there. Any questions you might have, I'm more than happy to help you out, or post your questions in the comments box. I'm going to commit to posting a lot more content. Thanks for watching.